Now, if you're like me, 2020 has been a little bit of a disappointing year. There hasn't really been anything that's majorly released, to be honest with you, and most of the titles that are currently out have kind of staggered updates, or some of them have had delays due to the issues that the outside world has presented and having to work from home. Now, I'm hoping 2021 will be different. And in this video today, I wanted to bring you guys everything that I'm looking forward to in 2021 that will hopefully be something you're looking forward to too. Now, this will have a mixture of both things that have already been released and are being updated, and also brand new titles, so let's dive on in. This list is in no particular order, and I gotta say, one of the first things that pops into my mind when thinking about 2021 is actually Squad. Now, most of you guys know that Squad has been released. It did very well. Its version 1 has been formalized. We had the Middle Eastern Alliance and Fallujah release, and ultimately Squad, as somebody who's been playing this game for 5 years now, before it was even on Steam, when it was like pre-alpha early access, it's become such a, absolute behemoth of a title, and it's doing incredibly well, and I'm really impressed to see its journey. But moving into 2021, we have version 2 releasing. We also have an entire living roadmap that will likely continue to release at various different points throughout 2021. Now, we knew version 2 was supposedly meant to come at the end of this year, but it got pushed back, and that makes sense. Things before Christmas tend to be a little bit rushed, and it was really no surprise to see it happen. But in V2, we have new insurgent vehicles, new Great British vehicles. We also have the Mosin coming in, as well as other insurgent weapons. We have helicopter improvements, and the map and lair overhaul, which is probably one of the hugest things to come to the game. Meaning that the lair of the map, meaning the actual mode/mission layout, and the factions within those layers are all now completely separated, meaning that you'll be able to vote for a map, a lair, and the factions facing each other within that specific map and lair without it being tied to a specific system as it was before. This is going to bring a lot of new variety to gameplay, and moving on into 2021, the game has a lot of improvements, including fast roping, amphibious vehicles, new UI and new UX overhauls, gamepad and joystick support, ultra-wide monitor support, the Pan-Asian faction, Australian faction, US Marine Corps faction, multiple new maps, and just an absolute behemoth and golden trove of content coming in 2021 for Squad. I can only see this game continuing to getting brighter and continuing to receiving more support because it just keeps growing. More people are coming back to it, more people are buying it, and overall, Squad in 2021 is looking like an absolute shout. And now for the last game on my list, which was already released, Hell Let Loose. This game has been making some serious strides, and although it had some stumbling blocks with Update 8, which have since been resolved, Hell Let Loose has a really bright future. We're talking about a game that has a plan ahead of it that's so absolutely grand and large that it's almost incomprehensible how impressive a title this game is going to be. Now, much like Squad releasing its version 1 in 2020, Hell Let Loose is officially launching in 2021, or so the current plans say so. And bearing in mind, Hell Let Loose has some really broad horizons. Now, not all of this is going to be in at launch, but at least some of it definitely will be. Not only is the game continuing to improve, but Hell Let Loose plans on having very intricate systems come into the game, including free look, which is something most people have been looking forward to, but also a Battlefield 1 style operations mode, which will have you fight multiple battles across various different maps in order to win an operation. This game also has an entire overhaul coming with vehicles and critical systems of the games, which are overdue some love. Hell Let Loose has progressively just been getting better and better, introducing a ballistic system, and continuing to try and improve the overall engine of the game, including things like SFX and animation overhauls, a full bullet penetration system, and more just coming. And for those of you unaware, Hell Let Loose has the brand new Eastern Front intended in 2021 with the Russian faction and 2 Eastern Front maps. And looking beyond that, we have the British forces with 2 Operation Market Garden maps, the Canadian forces including 2 Falaise Pocket maps, and Japanese forces including 2 Pacific Theatre maps. And several new maps will be added to each of the above theatres and are already in development as we presently speak. Hell Let Loose likely will release with the Eastern Front in 2021 and have a relatively sizable content catalogue. I can imagine that we might even see the British relatively soon, but the fact that the Canadian, Japanese, and various different forces and fronts are already planned and going to happen mean that I truly believe Hell Let Loose will cement itself as the #1 first-person shooter to be interested in. As a short honourable mention, I'd also like to shout out Beyond the Wire. I feel like this game released in a relatively small amount of content and in a sort of rough-ish state, but I can see it becoming a fantastic World War I shooter. That basically concludes all of the games that have previously released. Let's talk about some of the games that are coming. To start with, we have 83 the game. This is one of the titles that hasn't released yet, but we'll likely see some early access iteration of it release in 2021. 83 the game, for those of you who are unaware, is a Cold War era based first-person shooter featuring multiple factions such as NATO forces and of course the Soviet faction. This game has overarchingly a plan to have multiple factions fighting in multiple theoretical theaters of war for a Cold War gone hot scenario. I've really been looking forward to a Cold War style shooter for quite a while now, and I'm really excited to see 83 the game take this on. Most importantly, and probably one of the things that makes this the most interesting title of the year, is that 83 the game is being developed by Antimatter Games, and if that sounds familiar, it's because it's the people who were behind Rising Storm 2 Vietnam. Now, although Rising Storm 2 Vietnam wasn't exactly one of my favourite games, there were elements of the game and features within the game that made it a really special tactical/hardcore shooter, and I would describe the game as being gifted, but a little bit rough and just needing more love, more polish and less clunkiness. From the initial blog posts and videos released by 83 the game is going to have large open theatre of war maps using less of a linear feel than Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, and also has a very extensive arsenal of NATO, British and American weapons, as well as Soviet era weapons as well. The game also intends to have fully controllable helicopters akin to what we've seen in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam, and I'll be really interested to see where this game goes. To me, 83 the game looks like a Cold War era style squad game, and that makes me very excited. I'm really interested to see what Antimatter Games cooks up, and they have a very good reputation as a development studio, although some people feel that Rising Storm 2 Vietnam was kind of left behind and sort of abandoned. In my opinion, they were trying to move on to a new project, and I feel like they have the experience to really make a fantastic title. Next up for me has to be 9 to 5. 9 to 5 is going to be a free-to-play 3v3v3 team tactics first-person shooter set in a future where corporations rule and being a mercenary for them is a 9 to 5 job. Effectively, this game is taking a lot of elements from Escape from Tarkov, but kind of toning it down to be less of a super hardcore experience and more of a traditional Rainbow Six Siege style hardcore experience that we're used to. Bearing in mind, you have to know that Tarkov is kind of an outlier and has very advanced things that are akin to things like Arma 3. 9 to 5 is sort of hoping to scale it back a little bit and be a more accessible game, but still have very strong team-based and tactical elements. Now, the reason this game sparks my attention is because the concept of it is really exciting. It really will just be down to execution to see how well this thing happens to turn out. Red Hill Games has a lot of experience, but seemingly not too much in the first-person shooter realm, and I'm sure they're going to be relying quite heavily on community feedback to make this game something special. The initial blog posts and initial ideas surrounding the game, in terms of how the game will work and how you'll complete various missions as part of a 3-man team, looks really exciting, and I hope that this 3v3v3 concept ends up being really accepted and just interesting and fun to watch and fun to play. The game, of course, will have you facing off against 6 other opponents within your team of 3, and all of you can have various different loadouts, abilities, and tactical gear in order to make the experience a sort of team play based experience, whether that's reconnaissance, demolitions, or anything in between. This game plans on having you take on tasks as a 3-man mercenary team, and has very similar Escape from Tarkov elements in terms of extractions and completing various different missions within a certain map. Overall, this game could be really interesting. It's really down to execution here. When I first played the game, it looked a little bit rough in places, but you know, these are the kinds of games that will take time to develop, and I can see this game having possibly a very successful 2021 if things go well. Next up has to be Ready or Not. Now, Ready or Not is, well, basically what you would expect if you merged Rainbow Six Siege and SWAT 4 and they both had a baby. Ready or Not is aiming to be a really exciting co-op and tactical first-person shooter based on an elite SWAT team with up to 8 people taking part in cooperative play and also PvP elements within the game. It's being developed by Void Interactive and actually did intend on releasing this year, but fundamentally the game was in a bit of a rough state. Now, of course, the game had a bad sort of reveal. It didn't do too well in terms of how it was shown off to the public. There was a lot of backlash from the people who had supported the game so far, and since then the developers have kind of gone underground and just gone back to work. They've showcased a little bit more since then, and in fact the game actually looks really promising. I think Ready or Not was just one of those titles that perhaps showed its hand before it was simply ready, and showed off parts of the game when they weren't exactly in the best position to do so. I think that's just something that happens in development, and I think it's something that can happen to any development studio, but isn't indicative of the final quality of the game. I'm pretty sure if Squad showed off lots of gameplay trailers of their game when they were, pre-alpha early access with no weapon sights, no actual SFX soundings, or, no vehicles whatsoever in these huge maps, they would have been slated for it as well, and it would have affected the overall image of the game. But the actual concept of the game, having sort of a SWAT 4 style game that hasn't really been around for quite some time, is very interesting. The development team seem to be listening very intently to community feedback based on their first reveal of the game, and based on the people who have already played the game. I think fundamentally this game will end up being fantastic. I think it's something that unfortunately was just one of those things where, it showed its hand too early and it just wasn't quite ready to be seen by the general public. But overall, with a bit of polish, a little bit of time, and a little bit of love, I can see Ready or Not becoming a great game. Next on the list is Enlisted, and if this sounds familiar, it's because it's the guys over at Gaijin Entertainment, and they are planning on making a huge World War II title here, with hundreds of soldiers, armored vehicles, and aircraft in every battle, trying to reflect the scale of historical battles as much as they possibly can. They also want a layer of realism and a huge amount of variety, meaning that you can play as a tank crew, an airplane pilot, or actual infantry on the ground. There's also an AI element to the game where you can command AI troops and get them to do things within your squad. You can basically force them to defend positions or get them to attack a location, and they will obey your orders within the game. This game is massive by the looks of things, and bearing in mind it's being developed by a huge development studio who are the people behind War Thunder, so you can imagine that this title has a lot behind it. It's a next-gen only title, meaning that it's only coming to PC and Xbox Series X and Series S, and has pretty beefy system requirements as well. I can honestly expect this game to be fantastic. I think it's got a huge studio behind it and lots of budget, and if they get some things right, it'll end up being probably Battlefield 5 done right. It's not exactly the most hardcore or tactical shooter in the world, but I can see it being, effectively what people wanted from a Battlefield 5 game. The final game on my list is probably the least tactical shooter, so to speak, out of all of them, and actually resembles probably a little bit closer to a Call of Duty. Now, the reason I'm interested in this game is just because I feel like it's a bit of a lone wolf, and I feel like it's a game that actually could end up going somewhere pretty well if it ends up doing things well. And I'm talking about Boundary here. Now, Boundary is a relatively unknown game. This game was teased once during a PlayStation event. I can't remember if it was like E3 or something like that, and then it just went completely off the radar. This game is supposedly going to release in 2021, and it is a space first-person shooter. And the concept of the game is really interesting because the game relies on heavy movement mechanics more than anything else. You'll effectively be fighting in international space stations, and it's basically if the United States Space Force ends up becoming like an actually serious thing in 2050 or something, I don't know. Something of that relative concept. And the reason it's made my list is just because I haven't really had a fresh first-person shooter experience in quite some time that has done things really massively differently. Everything is sort of felt on very similar wavelengths, everything kind of feels very similar in a lot of ways, and having something that's just completely out there bonkers in an entirely different space, I actually think will be really good. It's made by a relatively unknown development studio as well, and I think it's going to be really good. The game so far has multiple team-based orientated modes like sort of domination, and also it does have a team deathmatch mode, but most interestingly it has a relatively advanced customization system with different optics and attachments for individual weapons, and being out of space it's heavily comprised of movement. I've actually played a VR game before. This game was called Echo VR, and it had a shooter component of the game, which is very kind of similar to what this game is, except Echo VR was more of an arena, and this is more out of space, but it just gave me very similar vibes, and I feel as though this could be an interesting title in the future. Anywho folks, that's about it for this video today. As always, thank you for watching, leave a like, leave a sub, and I'll catch you in the next one.